This is the Average Guy Network, and you have found Cyber Frontiers, show number 2, recorded on February 22nd, 2014. Cyber Frontiers is all about exploring cybersecurity, big data, and the technology shaping the future through an academic perspective. Christian Johnson, a student at the University of Maryland, and I are your hosts. Never on a schedule, but always up to date, we are broadcasting live from the AverageGuy.tv studios here in Bellevue, Nebraska, and we post the show each week with show notes out at the AverageGuy.tv. If you have questions, comments, or contributions, you can contact us via email. Just send me an email, jim at theaverageguy.tv. You can find me on Twitter at jcollison, and now call in our questions. It'd be great if you call it in for this show in particular, 402-478-8450, and we'll play that question right on the program. All right, Christian, good to see you again. It's been about 3 weeks since we've done the last show, and I know we've got some good stuff coming up for you. We'll refer folks back to Cyber Frontiers number 1, because that's kind of the foundation. If you're listening to this for the first time, that's kind of our foundational show, and a lot of things what we're going to talk about. But how are you, and welcome?
Good. It's going to be moving right into show number 2, and things are going well here, and I'm looking forward to getting to the content, and of course the big question that's been popping up from listeners over the past week. So it should be a good evening.
Good. Well, let's dive right in. We've got a lot of stuff to talk about. It's, we do run a little bit of a issue tonight because many people have asked about the data breach at University of Maryland. Of course, you're a student there. I think you probably owe us a disclaimer before we get things really rolling, so folks know what's going on with you.
Sure, yeah. So just to be clear, this is going to be my disclaimer for anything said on the show, that any opinions regarding this matter are going to be that of my own and not the university's, and any media inquiries related to this incident should be directed to the university's Chief of Communications Officer, who can be contacted at crystalb@umd.edu.
Very cool. So tell us, can you back, or where do you want to start with this? Because I know with this subject, I want to make sure you're on track with it. So where do you want to get started?
Sure. So, really, it's hard to pinpoint what's the best place to start because I think this came rather unexpected for students. I remember Wednesday evening, I was just getting out of classes and had gotten the email with the official statement from the university president, basically saying that this incident had taken place, and I really think that most students were relatively shocked that this type of email was coming out from an institution like University of Maryland, especially because we work so hard and have invested so much infrastructure in cybersecurity. We've about doubled our division of IT staff, including doubling employees who are solely focused on information security and security of systems. So I think this kind of came as a disappointment, and obviously saddened that this breach happened. But looking at the disclaimer, or excuse me, the email that was originally sent out by the president that was then publicized on the media, the description is as follows. A specific database of records maintained by our Division of IT was breached yesterday. That database contains 309,079 records of faculty, staff, students, and affiliated personnel from the College Park and Shady Grove campuses who have been issued a university ID since 1998. The records include name, social security number, date of birth, and university identification number. No other information was compromised, no financial, academic, health, or contact, meaning phone or address information. So that was really kind of the initial statement that students got, and that email kind of goes on for a bit. And really, it's being characterized as a sophisticated breach, meaning that this wasn't, a port that was left open or something that was just negligently running on the network to a secure system. The person who did this was good, and I think it's a fair statement to make that they would have needed to have a intimate knowledge of how University of Maryland designs and structures its security systems and its IT systems. So, I think it's fair. It's a fair statement that, although this happened to a university like the University of Maryland, it certainly wasn't your average script kiddie attack. That being said, this is certainly not the first time that somewhere like the University of Maryland or other universities for that matter have run into this issue. So, just in this past year, UNC had a breach in North Carolina, and that was one of those things where they took a system down for maintenance, and a security feature that's supposed to be in place just went offline during that maintenance and never came back online. And for 6 months, I think there was a significant number of Social Security numbers that were publicly available in a Google search engine because they had not properly resecured the web portal after maintenance was complete. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that if something like this had happened at Maryland, that would be pretty shameful, to be honest. But there's really no indication of that at this point. And I think though that all universities really struggle with this problem, and why is that? A university network in architecture is really considerably different from that of a corporate or a government network. And what I mean by that is universities have traditionally been a place where, in order for the maximum amount of information exchange and kind of freedom of information and for the ability to learn for all students, faculty, professors on campus, and to promote research, generally speaking, research universities and college campuses alike have kind of an open internet, which means that each university is more or less its own internet service provider, and every student who plugs a computer into a dorm room or is using campus wireless or so forth, you're being issued a public IP address that's accessible from the internet. So what that means is, unlike your typical home network like a Comcast or Verizon Fios, where you're going to get issued a public IP that goes to your router and is behind your router's firewall, and that IP is most likely a dynamic IP, so it's going to change every now and then. That's really not the case at the university level. As a student, my machine that's plugged into the jack in our own dorm room has 2 jacks, and each jack gets assigned a publicly accessible IP, and there's really no restrictions on restricted ports, which is common for ISPs, and filtering of any kind. Now, yes, there's network monitoring, and they check for security and concerns and so forth, and all of that is in place, but freedom of the internet and freedom to kind of put what technology and resources you want in your environment on a network, that's kind of been a hallmark characteristic of how university IT systems operate. So that, for me, I think is a good thing. So I have the ability to put a router in my own room where I can do kind of the same port blocking and security of my own devices. But what you have to understand is that when there's so many different use cases in a university environment, there are always being accommodations made into a security plan. Whereas if you work in a corporate or a government environment, there are really only specific functions that are going to happen at that particular place. Whereas, you might be doing research on so many different things at a university environment, some of which are very technologically oriented, that really requires having technology resources that you can be flexible with. And so, when these types of breaches happen, traditionally that is pointed to as saying, well, it's a university, they have all this data going on, but really the security is still in place despite that kind of open knowledge architecture is the way I like to think about it. In the past, and if you're interested, I mean, there's history about the university security here, Stanford's. I mean, you can find all sorts of stuff. The thing that I found interesting about this particular breach was that Back in 2006, there was a research paper published here by the Maryland Cybersecurity Center, which did a full analysis on our card reader system here and some of the weaknesses in that card reader. And they had eventually found that, the card reader had a magnetic strip on it that was creating a unique hash with social security numbers and university IDs, and there were similar concerns back then that the university addressed and revised. So, that might be an area of interest that is very well possible could be related to how this incident happened. And if you're interested in more information about that, I would encourage you to Google UMD magnetic card reader, and you should be able to find the paper and related resources. But it just kind of goes to show you that these are generally evolving things, but that oftentimes there are similar systems, security systems in place at any university that is a function of, the university paying for a third-party security system for card reader where, yeah, they're managing the card reader and stuff, but it's really the hardware and the actual software is a function of the security company that developed that. So you can also oftentimes see that security and data breaches that happen at universities are a result of the hardware that is installed and put into place, which is why whether you're at a university or elsewhere, when you're designing a network, it's very important to understand what hardware you're actually buying. It's not buying a router for your home network and saying, oh, I can get on the internet. You have to kind of look at the characteristics of the device and say, what are the risks, what are the characteristics of this device that, may be a security problem. And if you go back and read that paper, you'll see that the Lenel card system, Lenel is the company that built that card reader, there are some things security-wise that are not what I would call best practice for implementing a security card system. And I think a lot of people have seen that, but like I said, I don't think that's necessarily something that's uncommon. So we were issued an updated statement from the university a couple days ago, and that really the gist of that statement is that the University of Maryland Police Department is working with the U.S. Secret Service on this matter, and that additionally the university has partnered with the MITRE Corporation, which is a leader in systems engineering that's specializing in cybersecurity, to provide additional forensic analysis on how this attack happened, how to prevent such attacks in the future. But what really remains kind of a question for me is, are they going to get the perpetrator that did this? And to be honest, I think the answer to that is no. Clearly, if it was a student or someone who is currently active on the university, they would have had him by now. I mean, you're pretty much your MAC address you can spoof, your IP you can spoof, but generally if you're hooked into a university resource directly for an extended period of time, very easy to have a security trace done back to your device. So I really think that speaks to the fact that there was a level of sophistication and anonymous behavior in this, which really, to me, says that whoever did it knew what they were doing. And regardless of whether or not the security systems have weaknesses in them, you have to be among the best of the best in terms of hacker intellect in order to be able to even leverage weaknesses of that degree where they're so minute that, like I said, you have to have an intimate knowledge of software engineering, hardware engineering, but there are possibilities that I think can be explored, and I think that folks like MITRE and the U.S. Secret Service are going to know what they're doing to solve that issue. So
Christian, let me ask you this question, because it always seems like it's the same information that gets out every time, right? It's name, social security number, date of birth, those, some employee ID number or whatever. I'll share. We had a data breach at our bank recently, and I got a letter from them. But do we need to move? Do you think we need to move beyond the fact that we actually think that kind of information is ever going to be private? And what if we made the assumption that all that information was public, and we locked down the ways we allow? The biggest problem with the people having that information, of course, is identity theft and stealing or creating accounts, right? Do we just need to fix our financial system so that it's locked? So even if it is out there, because so much of it's out there now, right? I mean, I don't think any of that stuff's private. So do we need to change the way we do our financial system so that it can be public and it doesn't hurt us?
Yeah, so first off, you bring up an excellent point that I should have mentioned, which is that personally identifiable information, PII, is, like you said, perhaps one of the most common types of breaches where, they get a social number, they get a name, they get a date of birth, but they don't get the actual record, so to speak. They kind of get the top layer trim of whatever's in that database. And so what that really says to me is we need to rebuild how we authenticate our identity with companies, with banks, with anything, and arguably even with the government. I mean, look at how the Social Security number system works. You're issued one number that is, 9 digits, and you're only issued it once in your lifetime. And once it's compromised, you can't be issued a new one, and unless you're going to witness protection or something of that nature. And, like I said, there's really, to be honest, 9 numbers is not all of that sophisticated,
Yeah,
right?
it's not. I mean, PII should almost stand for public, instead of
Yeah,
private,
yeah,
right? I mean, because
yeah,
it's all out
exactly.
there. That stuff is out there. So,
Sure. And what's, like I said, what's interesting is that we have so many institutions and so forth that, like if I call a phone for a bank and they want to verify that I'm accessing the right account, they're going to ask me for my social security number, right? So is that
or
really the
or a
best?
form of it, right, or
Right,
something like that. Yeah.
right. So, is that really the best way to be identifying so many people? And I think the answer is no. I think one thing that's been really successful that we haven't taken advantage of is two-form authentication. So, for example, even on my own, personal accounts, I use two-form authentication, like with Google. So I have a password, and then I have my cellular phone. And when I log into a new system that I've never logged into before, I have to enter my password, but then I also have to enter in a 6-digit PIN. And the only way I can get that 6-digit PIN is through a text message sent to my phone. So that type of, and I'm not saying that would work at a kind of universal level of identification, but we're getting to such a technological era where these things are kind of cheap, getting very cheap to put in
Yeah.
encryption systems.
Yeah.
You know, whether it's RSA or something else, when you're born, if you're issued an RSA key token that has those changing digits every 60 seconds, and when you're eligible for, I mean, you're issued a social security number, right? So let's say your social security number becomes your PIN, so to speak. And if that social security number is breached, that's fine because they still don't have the hardware token that gives that additional identifying information. So when you go to a bank or when you talk to someone on the phone or so forth, and they ask, what is your social security number? You give them the first social security number digits and whatever your ID card reader. And that's technology that's so accessible and available today. We could even implement it on like a phone level where, a government run site that keeps track of tokens and generates digital tokens that, you can hook into your phone and so forth. So, there's a lot of ways to add layers of security to PII information that we're not doing right now. And yeah, obviously a countrywide rollout of something like that certainly isn't an easy engineering feat, but it's really not out of the realm of difficulty, I would say.
Well, and the U.S. government had a hard time rolling out a healthcare program
Yeah,
recently.
yeah,
So it is a struggle. It's not easy, at the national
sure.
level. But I just think we've got to think a little bit differently about our PII and assume that our PII is already public for the most part, and that what systems would we create then that wouldn't matter if that stuff was public. And I think that needs to be a very open conversation. Your two-form authentication is a great idea, and I think eventually we're going to have to move to something like that where we just assume that it's already been breached, and we're moving forward with something different.
Right. Yeah, and even looking at some of the databases, I think there's a cost benefit analysis. Jeff Bundy in chat mentions, cryptography and what steps would they need to take to encrypt and secure types of PII data. And honestly, I think there's a kind of performance cost analysis that has to be done when you start talking about scale, because once you start talking about millions of records, if there's a system that you need to interact with across that many number of records in a traditional kind of relational database, you're looking at joining tables and relationships, and those are very performance tuned queries. There's a lot of servers running those, and I'm more or less sure that it would add a lot of cost and a lot of overhead to encrypt all of those records so that every time an application wanted to speak with the server, it had to encrypt and decrypt, on a token-based mechanism. So I'm not really sure if actually encrypting the bits of um, the actual data. So like, should I really encrypt the text of what that first pin is? No, I really don't think so. And that's traditionally, again, we have so many systems already in place that store those pins. I would think it would be easier to just add the two-form authentication on the side where, yeah, you have some kind of token architecture that's doing that encryption and decryption. But once you've authenticated that you, in fact, are the user, then you're getting the unencrypted data without, having to encrypt, decrypt, which I think is really the problem when you start talking about, well, let's just encrypt everything. Encryptions can be broken. They're not easy to break. You need a kind of high-powered CPU or other resources at your disposal. But I think that's a good way to analyze and look at what is the cost-benefit of security. And two-factor, I think, is one answer to that. Even randomly generated IDs that change over a given period of time, that your whole identification is that. That's an okay idea in the sense that it would marginally increase the security, but the whole point of two-factor is the fact that you have something that's known to you and something that's random to you, which kind of makes it easier to work with and easier to kind of identify and put in the system. So, I think those are all things that you're seeing. Like I said, Google does it for my account. My account's secured with two-form. If you're a server administrator taking advantage of the cloud and Amazon Web Services, you can use two-form MFA authentication with, I think it's an Android app. I could be wrong, but so it's getting pretty popular in the private sector, and obviously secure systems use RSA keys and so forth. But in terms of actually culturally getting us to identify who we are all the time using that type of infrastructure, I think that takes some work. But I think it's doable, and I think the reality of the matter is that we're moving into an age where more and more of our identification of who we are happens virtually. I mean, how many times do you sit and think about it? You don't really identify who you are in person to someone when doing these types of transactions nearly as much as you would 10 years ago, especially considering, maybe you go to an airport every once in a while and hand a TSA agent your driver's license and identifying information, but all banking is done online now, all your financial transactions, online university students who are getting certifications on the internet. I mean, there's just so many things of our lives that have moved onto the internet, hence the point of this podcast, that we really need to start creating forms of identifying ourselves beyond saying, well, here's what exists in the physical world that I can use to identify myself, because we really should be taking advantage of creating a virtual world of identification, which I really think we've taken what we've had publicly and kind of pushed it onto computers. But computers are smarter than that, and can handle more than what we do in kind of the real world situation. So I think that's an important distinction to make in talking about this or really any other PII related matter.
Before we move off the topic, I'll just say I got a letter this in the last 2 weeks from my wife applied for a job, and I won't mention names of companies or things like that, although I just showed that on the on the video. But my wife applied for a job back in it was sometime last year, and we got this email. It says, writing to inform you or writing to alert you that information you provided during an online job application for the name of this company may have been accessed by unauthorized individuals. And then they go to say, on December 19th, 2013, we discovered that a retired internet application that provided job listings and accepted applications for positions was illegally accessed. While we do not have a conclusive evidence that the personal information was taken during this access, the unauthorized users may have obtained information on certain job candidates. And then they go on to say, on discovery of the potential data exposure, the servers involved were promptly secured and additional security measures were established. We are also actively cooperating with law enforcement and their investigation on this incident. Because your personal information, now this is interesting, and I want you to kind of comment on this. It says, because your personal information was potentially involved, we want to provide you with the information to assist you in protecting against the risk of unauthorized credit activity, right? So because so much of these breaches have to do with people with identity theft and then, of course, opening unauthorized accounts. We'd like to offer you 1 year of free identity monitoring through First Watch ID, like a LifeLock, one of those kinds of services. In addition, as additional protection or as an additional measure of protection, please also read the disclosure. So you can go through, they give you then a year, they're basically they're paying for an additional year of security. Christian, what do you think of those kinds of services that then do credit monitoring? This is kind of that proactive approach, right? Well, if we're going to assume your information is going to be out there and people can grab it, then we're going to proactively monitor your credit accounts to make sure they're not being accessed or unauthorized access.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be the kind of universal catch-all for when these types of incidents happen. That seems to be kind of the status quo standard response that companies provide when a PII breach happens. The university is also offering that free 1 year credit. I don't remember the company providing it, but they're not 100. You're not going to cover 100% of the data that was breached in terms of, like, if someone breaches a particular record, is this identity protection service going to catch that? And I would say, it really reduces the risk a lot. It doesn't eliminate it, though. And so, like I said, it really seems to be kind of the professional, courteous thing to do when a breach like this happens. But oftentimes, a lot of people who are affected by the breach says, really, is this all you can do after something like this happened? And that really seems to be kind of the standard response that most people give when this happens. So I would say they're effective, but it's no kind of guaranteed solution. And a lot of times, your information can get compromised and used without you knowing for months. I had a teacher once that someone had assumed his identity completely with the government and was filing tax returns under his social security number, and he started getting these weird notices and realized, well, this is, and then they put it together and realized that someone else had gotten his PII and beyond, probably. So it's really never 100% guarantee that, oh, we had this PII breach, now you can go on credit protection and extend it and you'll be fine. It helps, but it's really not a catch-all that is going to be effective across the board. So.
Well, I found it interesting. We're going to try it. I'm going to try out their service, and I was going to purchase something like a LifeLock anyway, and so I'm going to take it as an opportunity to give it a try, kind of get into that world and see. It can't hurt, especially if it's free. So we're going to give that a shot as well. What else do we want to cover around that topic? You got anything else there?
In regards to PIIs, not or the breach.
Yeah, just the breach in general.
Yeah, no, I think that's about it. It's still an ongoing investigation, so more things might unsurface, and I think we'll just have to kind of wait and see where that goes, if anywhere.
Cool. What else you got for us?
Okay, so this is related to PIIs, but not quite in the same realm of just PIIs. I'm not really sure. One of the things that we're still working on is what's going to be our ratio of cybersecurity to big data to kind of all the topics in between. So I'm working on it, bear with me. But one aspect that I really want to keep in this podcast is discussions about privacy, because it's really the merger between big data and cybersecurity and how it applies to you. So I came across an interesting read today on dark reading, which, if you're not familiar with the site, darkreading.com, it's really a great source for getting all things related to security and kind of information corporately. And there was an article posted today by Tim Wilson that there was a vulnerability in a dating app. I've never heard of this before, but it's called Tinder. And this exploit actually was able to take full advantage of the GPS on a user's phone who had installed the app on their phone accurate within 100 feet. So imagine, my name is Lucy, and I'm using this dating app, and there's this guy, I have no idea who he is, who opens my profile, knows things about a computer, and can now track me within 100 feet. Stalker much? Absolutely. And this exploit has been open since July 2013, I think, so about 6 months. And again, another one of those things where they originally saw a vulnerability in the application. They thought they had patched it fully. Clearly, they didn't patch it fully because this unearthed itself, and it really gets us into this ongoing discussion about why do we have cybersecurity and why do we have so many of these stories coming out, and maybe it's just because I'm in tune with it now, and that's what I'm doing here at UMD, but it always seems like in the public eye and public interest, these types of articles have gotten far more popular than what they were a couple of years ago. I mean, you can probably speak to it better because you haven't been, tuned into stuff like this for the past 6 months, but have you been noticing this kind of trend where everything, and I think it's fair to say that even with what happened with Snowden and so forth, all those types of ideas really got pushed into the media more. But let's even talk before that. So a couple of years ago, where did you see security related news of information technology, and how prevalent was it then compared to today?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's on the uptick, and mass media, or the mainstream media, is definitely picking up on it more than they ever have. And so we do see, and I think what we're seeing, especially around privacy, is more spectacular than it's ever been. Mostly, I think, because of these, right? Because it's cell phones, and because now, like you mentioned, with this Tinder app, you can drill down to, you can find somebody on these things with that particular breach, and that gets pretty serious. And so, I think it's caught the attention of mainstream media in the sense that the threats are real. Not that they haven't ever been real, but I mean, remember those early viruses that were just kind of goofy, and then, well, you might not, Christian. This was a while ago. Then Melissa came, that the very first virus that actually did destructive things to your computers, and so to go mainstream, and it infected millions of people in its wake, and then viruses got the attention of people. Before it was kind of like, maybe not. It's not a big deal. Then it catches their attention. So I definitely think these things are in the mainstream now. Although I think mainstream makes a big deal about them because it's sensational too, in some regards. So I think there's definitely an uptick.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And again, I like reading this website just because they have a lot of good stuff related to really all things security online. So they post good stuff. But yeah, I just thought that was bizarre.
Well, interesting with Tinder too, that they've made a big deal about that at the Olympics, because all the athletes are, that's how kind of they're hooking up, so to speak, and so they're using Tinder, and it's gotten a lot of attention over the last 3 or 4 weeks, where it may not have before, and that really is the problem too, right? When you have an app that goes viral, so we now have the ability for things to go viral, not just to a million, but to hundreds of millions of people now, all at once. And so that audience, the potential targets have gotten so big, and the payoff is so large for those kinds of breaches, that I think it's starting to make more and more financial sense for hackers to do this stuff and to get more serious about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. And what also seems interesting is that, again, why do we have these cybersecurity issues? It's a software engineering problem. It's a huge software engineering problem. It's, I hate to put it in this frame of light because oftentimes it's not the case, but it's like, it's oftentimes just bad development practices that these types of things start to creep up. And I think one aspect is either self-trained developers who don't really, who can get their way through code and can make something work, but have no idea if it's optimized, or no idea what the security implications are of what they just wrote. That's one problem. What I see in these kind of mobile applications far more often, though, is the quality assurance and testing is always an issue in software development and engineering. And some of these applications, in order to pull off, there's huge teams of developers writing these applications, right? So if you have, let's even say 10 developers working on any given application, they're all writing their own particular piece of the software. They're all merging to a common software repository where they're holding their source code. And that introduces, just in terms of different skill sets working on different aspects of an application, and then all of it having to get merged and quality assurance and debugged and tested, that introduces a lot of room for security holes. And it seems almost as if all of the really popular major applications that are out on the internet that have gone viral have had security problems because they've gone viral, which to me says that almost any application you have out there that does anything meaningful has a security problem. It's just how popular it is and how attractive it is for a hacker to try and exploit something that it actually gets to a point where, here's your latest vulnerability.
Yeah, for sure. No, and the other part of the problem is that a lot of these companies are small, and they don't, they're it's a bunch of guys on the West Coast that are like, hey, let's create this app that does this. The last thing I think, and these are broad generalizations, by the way, but I think the last thing they think about is getting that thing security scanned
Right.
inappropriately, right? Because it's expensive, it slows things down, they need time to market, all those pieces. One of the things we do at Gallup is every application that goes out, we've got a team of people that scan that stuff and make sure that it's not exposing vulnerabilities, it doesn't have openings in it. We've got guys constantly watching. I mean, data is everything to us, so constantly watching to make sure that that our systems are secure that way. I'm not so sure in a startup that if that's happening all the time. Now,
Oh, sure.
both University of Maryland, the bank that sent me this letter, are not startups, and they still have breaches, right? And the bank I got the letter from, I mean, they're a big bank, so I say shame on you for not having the right things in place to make sure those things don't happen. So it is messy. Paul Brennan was saying in chat, we were talking earlier about two-factor authentication, and some of these server farms are gigantic in a way that, although if it's unsecure, if you have servers that are unsecure enough that someone can find them, shouldn't you be running your own regression security testing against them to make sure? It's almost you need to hire a hacker to just check your stuff,
Yeah, and we'll actually get to that a little bit later in the show.
Yeah, good.
So, cool.
Let's go ahead and move on.
Yeah, so before we get off kind of the privacy topic, I want to recommend a site that is just kind of a interesting feed that if you're an RSS guy and you like having your feeds, this would be a cool thing to point to. Hyperbolic, hyperbolic.cs.umd.edu. That's just a really standard status quo WordPress blog that is run by one of the research professors here on campus and students that are in this area. And what we do is we post articles of interest that are related to privacy, security, government, liberty, quality of information, etc. And so that's actually a really cool place to kind of find relevant things that are really fresh on the internet that are making its way into campus conversations. And I post there somewhat often. I put the Tinder dating app link in that feed today. So a good place to point your RSS to if you are interested in pulling stuff off. It's really kind of used as just a kind of place to aggregate cool links and articles relevant to these topics. It's not so much a commentary site or anything like that. So that's kind of a cool way to digest some of this information that myself and other people who are in this stuff are going through and reading and filtering content for you, and so to speak.
Very cool. We put that out in chat as well.
Cool. So with that being said, I'm going to leave privacy there for now, but on next show, Cyber Frontiers episode 3, we're going to have a special guest who is the epitome of all things privacy, software engineering, and cybersecurity on campus. And should be a really cool treat to have him on the show, and he'll have some really insightful things to talk about related to these topics. So be nice to interview him for a bit, have him talk about what he does here, and that will be our first guest on the show, and many more to come. So that's
That'll
just
be dynamite. I'm
yeah.
really looking forward to that. That's one of our goals in this is for you to take advantage of some of the contacts you have there on the campus. So
Yeah.
pretty excited about it.
So yeah, we're going to start rolling those guests in and getting some cool conversations going that are really relevant to what goes on here.
I'll be honest, you guys are going to leave me behind. It'll just glass, you'll be talking just to, well, Jim's checked out.
This person's pretty excellent at bringing it down to levels, so I'm excited.
Yeah, excited for it. You bet.
Cool. So I think the last topic I want to cover that's along the lines of what you were saying earlier is, well, it would almost be nice if we had a hacker that we could hire to say what are our weaknesses. And there are techniques, so to speak, where you can hire your own hacker. In fact, you can hire the internet to hack for you on purpose, and that sounds kind of that's kind of a loaded statement in and of itself, but let me kind of explain. So one of the research projects that is being completed by all ACES students, cybersecurity students here this semester in the honors program, is a project on honeypots. And if you've never heard the term honeypots, a honeypot is a system that, whether it's Windows or Linux or whatever, is designed, it just runs and sits on your network for the mere purpose of having someone try and get into it. So it has no services on it that you care about. It is not a production system. So it's merely a computer and a IT resource that you're putting on your network to try and lure hackers to get into it, break into it, and use it. So there is a ton of research that can be done in this area, right? So first off, there's two classifications of honeypots that are most common, what we call high interaction and low interaction honeypots. Low interaction honeypots are very easy to deploy. So they typically are they're not an actual full operating system. They're just emulating certain behaviors and activities of popular programs that are targeted. So for example, a low-powered honeypot would be, if I had some kind of application emulating an FTP server that could respond to basic commands, do basic things, but it was nothing more than an FTP server that led to absolutely nowhere if it got cracked. Some upsides, like I said, really easy to deploy, really easy to gain information. The obvious downside, though, is that a lot of hackers are very aware that honeypots are a real thing, and so they've gotten pretty good at seeing, oh, this isn't a real FTP server, I am going to leave now. And so the opposite of that spectrum is what we call a high interaction honeypot, where you give them the full slice of bacon, right? You have the operating system on there, you're running an SSH connection, an RDP connection, you got some users logged in that are, of course, emulated. And the idea is you give them the whole run-of-the-mill to try and get into the system, right? And the advantages of that is that there is just such a wealth of information you can get. Just to kind of give you a couple examples, you can monitor. What you do is you set up these honeypots to log data to a remote system, so that when the hacker hacks into the system, they don't see that you're logging data about, blah 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 happened. So it's very common to always log keystrokes, network activity, and you can do all sorts of analysis with the type of data that you can collect on honeypots. The obvious one is, by virtue of someone trying to connect to a system that is not designed to do anything, all traffic is treated as suspicious, because if no one is an authenticated user that is supposed to have access to that box, you can pretty much make the assumption that anything else connecting to it is malicious or a bot of some sort, because there's no functional purpose in your organization for someone to be logging into that system. So that's kind of rule number one. But once you get there, you can do all sorts of things like study what are the most commonly used passwords that are trying to be hacked in dictionary attacks. And once the user gets on the system, what do they try and do with it, so forth. And there's a really great research paper, I'll try and get it in the show notes, called A Night with a Burford. And it's this really cool article about someone who got was running a honeypot, and the hacker entered into the system, and just kind of a whole description of what the hacker was doing, what the behaviors were, what the reactions were. And I think that paper was one of the catalyst papers for honeypots, and they're arguably becoming one of the most maybe not one of the most, but a very effective tool at doing cybersecurity in corporate networks, because it's a really great tool for security specialists to say, okay, we're getting these IPs and we're getting these types of intrusions to this box that we know are malicious. Now we can put those as a blacklist on our systems that are production and do matter, and we're gaining security by putting this bacon out there. Of course, and I think I don't know if I mentioned this, but the downside of putting all that bacon out there is that if a hacker does get into it and you're not closely monitoring the box and so forth, there's a very gray area in the sense that, yes, it's illegal that they have hacked into your system, but if you, as the kind of researcher or corporate member, you're responsible for that box. And so if you know that you've put this box to willingly trap people into it, you have to be responsible for what goes on that box, because someone is trying to get into it all the time. So if a hacker does get in there and then starts, let's say he uses that box and turns it right around and starts trying to hack the U.S. Air Force with it, well, guess what? You're responsible. So there's a big risk-reward kind of benefit, and you have to find that happy medium. There are very good ways to do that. Obviously, there's some filtering and techniques you can use and so forth. Obviously, the biggest one is just having a alert go to your phone and email that says, hey, someone did hack this honeypot. You should see what they're doing right now. And that doesn't mean you have to be staying up 24 hours a day when the hackers across the other side of the world are hitting your box, but there are ways to kind of mitigate those concerns. And so I would argue that high interaction honeypots are much more frequently used for kind of research purposes and intrusion detection systems, in the hope that they help stop some of those advanced persistent threats and other things that you really don't want. If there's an opportunity for a hacker to get to a production system and you can stop them on a system that doesn't matter to you at all, you've just got a lot of intrinsic value out of doing that. So not really sure if this is something that we can kind of say, well, let's put together a kind of tutorial and guide on how to do a honeypot at home. I'm not really sure how many people would be interested in running a honeypot at home, especially because the average person doesn't run a web server from home, doesn't really have ports open for stuff, so it doesn't really make sense in that kind of environment. But I think it would be cool if we could find some application relatable to that. So one example I can think of is, there's a project on Google you can Google. I need to also find the URL included in the show notes, that's called the HoneyNet Project, where they keep track of a list of blacklisted IPs and saying, okay, this IP was a harvester on this honeypot. This IP was a spam email system. This IP was a botnet that got in and did whatever. And that database, they build basically an API that you can access that database and already have a lot of that information. So, from an average guy perspective, if you're running a WordPress site, or if you're running whatever that's a service of any kind that you're opening up, you might be able to find a way to actually bridge that application or service with a online site like the HoneyNet project to actually create a form of blacklisting that's going to protect you from a lot of the nasty stuff that's out there. So it's interesting when you said it would be nice if we could hire hackers, because the reality is, if you do give something that's an attractive target, they will come to you. And if you're very kind of clever in how you design your honeypot, and again, there's so many factors in how you can put a honeypot together that This is really I would say there's beginner ways to do honeypots and there's advanced techniques too, right? But
Yeah.
you can gain a lot of value in an organization by doing that. And there's an article in InfoWorld that basically says that if you don't have a honeypot, don't bother calling yourself a security pro at all, which I don't know if I fully agree with, but that's really becoming increasingly popular in these types of environments. So if you are kind of really interested in a technical tidbit of cybersecurity, this might be an area we can go down and explore a little bit more and kind of find a home user type project of doing a honeypot.
Let me mention, because I kind of used the honeypot concept a couple years back when I was doing a lot of work for friends and relatives, right? So this is kind of a honeypot, but not in the way you've defined it, but this is the way I thought of it. So I was getting a lot of, hey, my computer's broken, or it's slowing down. I don't know how to fix it. My laptop's not working. Can you get the data off of it? And sure enough, I would go to pull the data. It would be full of viruses, right? And I'm like, oh, geez, And I got to the point I didn't even want to fire up those computers on my network. I'd bring them, I always bring them to the house because it's a lot easier to work on them here than it would be to work on them in their location. So I actually built a PC, and its sole purpose, it was off the network. I would plug it in every once in a while, update it, and then take it off the network again. And its sole purpose was to host hard drives and systems that I brought in the house that I could plug them into, and at least I had a system that I could with, especially like with a hard drive. But I knew that if it got infected, it wasn't the end of the world, right? It wasn't attached to my network. It wouldn't spread throughout the house. And so I used it in particular, I'd pull a hard drive over, and it was real helpful. I'd have a drive bay I could put that hard drive in, and then I'd scan it right away. First thing I do is scan, not boot up the hard drive to that PC and scan it, but just put it in where it's not running and start scanning it. And man, I'd find stuff all the time. So that was something, if you're a tech support guy for your family or your relatives or your neighbors or whatever, and a lot of the guys that listen to this show are, that was kind of something that saved my bacon a couple times. Now, for whatever reason, over the last year, those support calls for me have died. I don't know. Maybe I got to be a jerk. Maybe I charged too much money, which was zero, so I don't know how I could have done that. Or the PC just isn't. It maybe with Windows 7 things are just more robust for people and they don't get it as much. The virus control, antivirus is better. I don't know. I'm just not seeing as many family problems as I used to see. But that was how I kind of deployed the honeypot concept internally to make sure that I wasn't getting viruses on our network.
Yeah, and oftentimes, so when you get someone who says, "Oh, I think I have a virus," what is it that makes them come to you and say, "Oh, I think I have a virus"?
Usually it's slow performance.
Right.
They'll say, "Hey, it's slowing down," and they don't almost never say that. Nobody wants to admit it. It's almost, "Ooh, I got some slow performance," and I always think, "Oh, you probably picked up a virus." But those numbers have drastically dropped for me in the last 6 months to a year.
Yeah, and it almost makes me wonder one of two things. Either A, yes, they are becoming less targeted towards kind of consumer devices, but what I think is more probable is B, cyber criminals are getting a lot smarter at designing lower CPU usage bots and viruses and keyloggers and whatever, so that unless a user is actually running a scan or a guard or an active antivirus guard actually picks something up, if it slips through the cracks and is not using hardly any CPU resources and is kind of a clandestine behind the scenes thing, well, that might be a reasonable explanation for why those calls are coming in less. Because, the viruses I remember from back in like the XP days, they would just trash the box. It would be like, let me just reformat it now because it's uninstalled all of my Windows services. It's, done all this stuff. And it's much easier for me to just reformat the box and have to worry about trying to undo all this and not know if I got everything. But I really, like you said, I have not seen that a lot. And for the average user, and I've said this before on the home tech shows, that 90+% of the viruses you're going to get is from going to stupid sites that you probably don't need to be in the first place. And an easy way to avoid that is the host blocker that's put out by MVPS, and that will pretty much block. Not only does it transparently make all advertisement of any sort disappear from any and all sites, which is wonderful, because guess what? YouTube ads never load; they just go straight to the video, and you know, like I said, it's an advertisement-free world when you have the host blocker on. But more importantly, when there are those rogue ads and those redirects that you don't want anything a part of, they're going to get completely dropped by the host blocker. So that's a way to kind of stop a large number of the common things that are going to get those types of viruses slipping through with your internet browsing.
Yeah. The other thing I like to use, we use OpenDNS, and I have an account through them. We talk about, Rich and I met with Amber Gott about 2 weeks ago. She's one of the marketing reps for LastPass. And we talked a little bit about that. But at the end of the show, we talked about using OpenDNS. They also keep you from, malicious sites are a problem. When you get redirected to a site that's been infected and then you are infected, DNS blocks that out. OpenDNS blocks that automatically. And so you've got an opportunity to stay safe. So I don't, on my home network, I can't even remember. I run antivirus all the time. I can't remember the last time I worried about it, kind of deal. It's we were talking about this. I'm like, I haven't even thought about that in a while. That used to be a big deal, big topic, and I don't think we just worry about it as much as we used to. Much like I think, as we wrap it up here, we're going to get this financial security thing right. Eventually it's going to be better, right? We're going to get there. It may take a while, but I remember 15 years ago when viruses ran rampant, and we thought, oh man, are we ever going to get this under control? It's not completely under control. We still have that problem, but I think it affects a lot less users than it used to. And people are getting smarter. The software is getting a little bit smarter. Now we just have different problems that exist. So
yeah.
Christian, anything else as we wrap this up? We're right at the hour mark.
Yeah, no, I think that's enough for this show. The dynamic is going to change a little bit. Shows going forward, I'm really going to start getting some high-profile guests on the show, and they're going to talk about their specific subject matter, and of course applicable to all the topics that the show covers. So we'll probably run some interviews and some talks with folks for the next few shows before we do another Christian Jim dialogue, I guess is what you would call that. Dialogue, monologue.
Mostly you.
So monodialogue.
Yeah.
So
that's good. I like it. I always learn something. So very good. So good. Well, if you're listening to this, it's downloaded through the Home Tech feed. Then thanks for listening to it. We got a lot of good feedback on the first one that we did, and so we'll do a few more of these before I take them out of the feed, and Cyber Frontiers gets its own feed. Christian and I will kick that out, including album art and music coming up here. For now, we're just going to keep it plain because we want to kind of get a feel for the format going forward. I will let you know if you're listening to this and you're not a regular Home Tech listener, head out to theaverageguy.tv. Christian's in a lot of those as well, although less lately just because he's been really busy. But go out to theaverageguy.tv, and the Home Tech feed is over there if you want to listen. We've got kind of a general tech show that we do every Thursday night, 8 p.m. Central. We say here, never on a schedule but always up to date, because we never know when we're going to do this. We throw these together. We thought maybe last night, and then we ended up doing it on Saturday. I want to thank Paul and Jeff for coming out. They joined us live tonight. We tweeted out maybe an hour in advance and said, hey, come join us. But we are thankful for those guys doing that. If you have questions, comments, or contributions that you want to get into the show, a question for Christian, you can email us. It's just Jim, or you can email Christian at theaverageguy.tv. You can find me on Twitter at @jcarlson. Christian is TheWizBM there over on the tweets. You can call in your questions 402-478-8450. Like Christian said, we'll be back with another Cyber Frontiers. I've got an awesome interview ahead. And so be watching that in the feeds. Christian, have a great evening, and for those watching us live, thanks for coming out. Good night.
You too, Jim. Good night, everyone.